So things haven't turned out as you hoped. Life took a turn. A bump. A darkened sky. And at times it may have seemed there was no hope. But here's the good news. Our God is the God of fresh starts. Our God is the God of new beginnings. Our God brings new mercies, new compassions, not just once a year, not just when things are bad, but every single morning. This season has been tough. And for many of us, things will never be the same. But we are here, breathing, maybe smiling, or crying, or shouting, or laughing. But we are here, feeling, maybe fighting, or cheering, or seeking, or grieving, but we are here, living. And we are not alone. Our God is here. Our God is with us. And our God is the God of new creations.
You know, in the context of what we've been learning, we've been going through Exodus chapter and verse because we like to go through the Bible chapter and verse. We want to get the whole thing. We want to get down, go deep. Sometimes we look at Hebrew, sometimes we look at Greek, and we try to understand it. We don't want to just grab a scripture here or there, pull it out of its context, or just, maybe it's something that relates to a topic and just move on. We want to get down and we want to get in there and find out God's whole counsel. And when you do that, He's going to take you to what's next. And sometimes it's not what you expect. Isn't that so? When we talk about God being the God of new beginnings, the context here is these people, the Jewish people, they had just done the worst betrayal that you can do from God's perspective. It doesn't get any worse from God's point of view. Maybe from our point of view, but nobody's asking us. God is God. And He decided that this was so bad, He was willing, He even said to Moses, look, man, you just say the word, I'll wipe them out, and I'll restart with you. Because you and I have a good relationship, but these people, obstinate, stiff-necked, stubborn, won't follow me. I mean, that's devastation. And if it wasn't for the fact that Moses pleaded and got down on his face and repented, if it wasn't for the fact that the people themselves, many of them turned and repented and turned back to God, if it wasn't for that repentance, remember, God never changes. He will always respond to a repentant heart. But if they had not, can you imagine what that devastation would have been? See, God is the God of new beginnings. And so He's renewing this broken agreement between Him and these people. That's what He's doing in chapter 34. He's giving them a new beginning. But in the middle of that new beginning, He gives them a warning. Now, last week we got through verse 12, but we're actually going to step back to verse 11 because we need to see the whole context of what's going on here. So Exodus chapter, it says 43. That's wrong. It's 34. Pastor needs to get that fixed there. Okay. But anyway, Exodus 34, verse 11. Be sure to observe what I am commanding you. What I'm commanding you today. See, this is now. This is not something that's in the past. God is the God of now. And he's saying, right now, remember, because I'm going to drive out the Amorite before you, the Hittite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, the Jebusite. Now, what does he mean by that? This was a cultural grouping. Archaeologists today call it the Canaanites. And that includes different people, like the Hittites that he mentions here. The Hittites actually come from what is today Turkey. And they had colonies that were in the land of Canaan. Amorites, the same thing. They came from another area, but they had colonies. So this was kind of like a cultural melting pot of different groupings of peoples in this area, in the land of Canaan. But they had a specific overall culture that kind of everybody had. Does that make sense? Very much like America. In America, how many of you know there are plenty of groups within the group? We call ourselves American. The official language here is English, but there are plenty of people that speak other languages. There are plenty of people that celebrate other holidays. They're still Americans, but within this group. Now, America has a certain culture that hangs over top that most people will subscribe to within this area. This was the same as the Canaanites. The Canaanites had an overall culture throughout the area, even though there were different groupings with different languages. And that's what he's saying. He said, I'm going to send you in there. I'm going to send you in there to drive them out. Now, watch yourself, he says, that you make no covenant, no agreement, no contract that with these people, with the inhabitants of the land into which you are going. Why? Because if you do, it'll become a snare in your midst. A snare meaning a trap. It'll be like a rope grabbing hold of your ankle. It's going to trip you up. It's going to hurt you if you make any kind of agreement. So God is not saying, I don't want you to make an agreement with these people because I just don't like these people. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, these people will be a snare to you, and I know that, so don't make a deal with them. That's what he's trying to say. But instead, what I want you to do, he's saying to the people, is I want you to go in there and I want you to tear down the altars and smash the sacred pillars and cut down their asherim. And what are those? Now, obviously, an altar is a place of sacrifice. Now, in the Canaanite culture, most of the time their sacrificial altars were on the tops of hills. So they were called high places. And that's where they would have an altar. They would build a stone altar. I've seen some of these. Some of them could be as big as this stage, made out of rock, and they're lifted about this high. And that's where they would do their sacrifices to their gods. That's what he's talking about in terms of altars. He's saying tear those down, destroy them, literally obliterate them, tear them up, literally pry up the rocks and throw them away. And we find in archaeology many of these altars destroyed that way, but others were not destroyed. And it is clear that some of these altars were there for quite a long time. Then it says, smash their sacred pillars. Now, at this point, I'm going to have to warn some of you that some of the stuff that we're going to talk about in archaeology today is real history, and it's really gross. It's really graphic, and I will be as careful as I can be. But the truth is, you need to understand who the Canaanites really were. When we're talking about sacred pillars here, what we're talking about is phallic symbols. You understand what I'm talking about? These were not good. And there were a lot of them. And I'm not even going to go into details on that, but he says, tear those down. And then he says, cut down their asherim. Now, the I am here in Hebrew means plural, so this comes from the word Asherah. So the asherim was plural of that. Asherah was a female fertility goddess that was worshipped throughout the land of Canaan and into Phoenicia. And this goddess was worshipped by a sexual act. So to worship the goddess, you would come to the high place to do a sacrifice, usually a human sacrifice, but not always. Sometimes they were nice and they killed goats instead. But what they would do is part of the worship was to have sex with one of the prostitutes that would be at that particular shrine. And they had both male and female prostitutes, because if you decided that this week you wanted to worship Baal, Baal was the male, so that you would have sex with the man. And if you were worshiping Asherah, you would have sex with one of the females. That's how they did things. And so he's saying, now the word Asherim is, they would have these trees or bushes that they would plant around the top of the mountain. So it kind of looked like a bald head with the kind of like this. Anyway, if you can picture that. But in those bushes and in those trees, that's where the sexual activity would take place. So he's saying, tear that down, literally cut the branches, the trees right down, burn it, just destroy it. That's what's going on here. Now, some people have a whole lot of difficulty with the idea of God's command to destroy the Canaanite culture. They have a problem with that because we look back in history and we make judgment calls based on our sensibilities of the 21st century. And the idea of genocide, the idea of attacking and destroying an entire culture, kind of goes against our grain. You know what I'm saying? Not realizing the type of hypocrites we really are. Because the truth of the matter is, within the last 100 years, 120 years, we fought 2 major wars worldwide. Why? Against an evil culture. The Nazis were an evil that stuns us, what they did. But we fought against them and destroyed that culture. Why did we do that? We destroyed it down to the last city block in Berlin. In the 1980s, I went to Berlin. And back then, before the Berlin Wall went down, when the Soviet Union was still controlling East Germany, I saw things that were amazing to me as a kid, because I was 19 years old at the time, and I'm looking at this, and there was piles of rubble. There were bombed out buildings that had never been repaired. From World War II, I saw literally piles of rubble the size of this building that had not been cleaned up. And when I went to East Berlin, it was even worse, because the Soviet Union controlled that area, and Soviets were not, how many of you know that they really were not really the good guys? And when I crossed over into East Germany, it looked like the war had happened last Tuesday. The city was mostly destroyed. I took some pictures. I wasn't allowed to, but I didn't listen to the communists, and I took pictures anyway, because I was 19. But anyway, it was amazing. And I got to thinking even back then about the judgment of God. The Nazis touched the apple of God's eye when they went after the Jewish people. And he destroyed their culture. You got to understand, the Nazis had the world's largest standing army. They had the world's largest, most powerful, and most sophisticated air force that history had ever seen up to that point. There was a very real possibility that they were going to take over the world. But they crossed the line. And when they crossed the line, when their culture crossed a line that could not be taken back, God sent judgment. And that judgment went down to the last city block. They destroyed the Russians on one side, the Allies on the other. We destroyed the Nazis all the way down to the last city block in Berlin. The devastation was unreal during World War II. God does not shy away from judgment when it's necessary. That's just a fact. And in this case, these people, the Canaanites, had reached a place that from God's point of view, there was no turning back. And people, we want to judge that and say, what right does God have in order to order the Jewish people to come in and destroy the Canaanites? Well, we're talking about the author of life here. He has the right to decide who lives, who dies, and why. And how many of you know that God is not unjust? He's not. Now, let's think about it for a second. Why would I say that this culture had reached a point of no return from God's point of view. Well, now we're going to have to talk a little bit about archaeology. Take a look at this picture. This is a picture of what's left of a Canaanite temple. This is in northern Israel somewhere. And the Canaanites had reached a level of such degradation that around this temple that you are looking at here, there's a field. And in the field, you will find jars. I couldn't get a picture of it, but there are jars about this deep, thousands of them. And in these jars, you will find the remains of children, because they were heavy into human sacrifice. That's how they worshiped their God. That was the sacrifice they made on the altar. And I can't even tell you the evil they did to these children before they burned them alive. Thousands of them. I had to say I can't say that out in public. It was so bad that some of the archaeologists that were studying this and going through and figuring out what the words meant, and the pictures and things, they would literally go out of the archaeological dig and just vomit. They just could not believe what they had seen. The evil was unreal. These people worshiped demons. And they worshiped them by torture. They worshiped them by an absolute unrestrained sexual immorality that was so bad that when we just, what bodies we do discover, their bodies are literally riddled with syphilis. There were so many sexually transmitted diseases spreading around. Infanticide was common in this culture. It was truly vile. And here's what I've discovered about human beings, that apart from the restraint of the Holy Spirit, all you have to do is look at history and you will see it over and over and over and over again. You see it with the Aztecs. You see it with the Phoenicians. You see it in India. You see it in Polynesia, in Hawaii. I've actually been in Hawaii to some of the mounds where they did human sacrifice. Cultures will always slide into that kind of just, I don't even know how to describe it. I've been to Haiti twice. My cousin's been there 10 different times. And we have friends there that, and when we're talking to Haiti, we're not just going to Port-au-Prince, we're going way up north out into the sticks, into places that, tourists never go. In fact, I've been to villages where I was the first white person these children had ever seen, and boy, they thought I was the funniest looking thing they ever saw. They're coming up to me going, does it rub off? No, I'm okay. You know what I mean? It was kind of fun. It was an interesting experience. But there was an earthquake there. How many of you heard that? And this earthquake killed 300,000 people in Port-au-Prince. Unbelievable. But when the Parliament building was destroyed, and right next to it there's a cathedral, this was destroyed, what they discovered in the foundations. See, back in the 50s, Haiti was one of the most beautiful places in all the Caribbean. Beautiful resorts. People would go there from the United States on vacation. Cary Grant loved going there because it was beautiful. Not anymore. Because in the 50s, they literally out in the open, their leaders pledged themselves to the voodoo gods. And the voodoo gods require human sacrifice. And when those buildings were destroyed, they found in the foundations human sacrifice remains that had been buried underneath. And having been there and heard the voodoo drums myself, having seen the temples, and you wonder why such devastation is on that island? You worship demons, bad things are going to happen to your country. That's just reality. That's just reality. Now, I know some people are going to want to argue with me, but you're wrong. So, going on. Just thought I'd point that out. Now, some people, they get all upset and they think, well, here's God sending in this, sending in the Jewish people like God, I think, sent the allies in. I mean, it was the same kind of a thing. But we think, well, but the Canaanites are still human, right? I mean, how can you justify what God is telling them to go and do? Because can't people be reformed? No one has a right, people will say to me, to judge one culture as being so degraded. Well, first of all, I didn't make that judgment call. Who did? God did. But then when I'm talking to people out on the street, we're passing out tracts or whatever, because this question will come up, how do you justify that? How do you answer that? And I'll say, well, I'll tell you what. It's kind of like this. How many of you have ever heard of honor killings? You ever heard of an honor killing? Not very many people. Let me explain how it works. In some cultures in this world today, if your daughter does something that dishonors the family, she goes off and she has a sexual relationship outside of marriage, for example, when she's a teenager. How many of you know that that's not uncommon in the United States? Well, in other countries, it is uncommon, because to do such a thing would be to dishonor the family. And then the father or the oldest brother would have the obligation to kill the girl who had dishonored the family. This is normal practice in many cultures today, particularly in the Middle East and in Afghanistan, in some parts of Asia, and also in some parts of southern China, also in Indonesia. Now, what happens when those people move to the United States of America? They bring their culture with them. So how can we, in America, who've only been a country for 243 years, how can we say that that culture that is thousands of years old is wrong? How can we say that? How can we judge our culture as better than theirs? After all, they're much older than we. They've been around a lot longer than we have. How do you say that's wrong? And when I'm talking to people in the street, well, that's not the point. Yes, it is the point. Why? Well, we've got different laws here. So why are our laws better? Where did you get your standard? And usually I get silence at this point. And I say, well, what about female genital mutilation? That's common in most parts of Africa. And when they come to the United States and they perform the same procedures on a 5-year-old little girl, what are you going to do in the United States? That culture is 10 times older than America. What makes our culture right and theirs wrong? Why is it wrong? And everybody gets quiet. How about child brides? Better than half this planet still makes arranged marriages, and they do the arranged marriages when the kids are 5 or 6. And oftentimes they will have them actually get married. I've seen pictures of the ceremonies. And they bring that culture to the United States. Why is it wrong here, but not wrong there? Is there any real wrong, or is it just arbitrary? Because that's the truth. How do we decide? Well, if there's not a standard of what is really right, then it can be whatever you want it to be. And whoever's got the power, whoever's got the oldest culture can decide. And how many of you know that they're reviving, even now in Norway, they're reviving the worship of Thor. They're actually out there doing the same rituals that the Vikings did because they think it's cool, not remembering that the Vikings also practiced human sacrifice. But they'll get there. They're already doing it in Haiti. They'll get there. Why? Because that's what human beings do. Without the standard that God sets. God is the author of life. God is the one that invented humanity in the first place. He is the one that determines what is good and what is bad. And it is God in His Word that says a human sacrifice is absolutely unacceptable. It is God in His Word that says what is right and what is wrong. That's where we find the principles. And when a culture does not conform to that, that culture is wrong. I don't care how old it is. That's the standard. And it's important for us to grasp that and to recognize this. Chuck Smith, how many of you heard of him? Okay, Chuck Smith, he used this analogy in order to explain the same situation. He said, imagine a playground like this one. You got beautiful, innocent children. They're out there playing. They're having a ball. But all of a sudden, into this beautiful setting comes a great, big, huge German shepherd. And that German shepherd is foaming at the mouth. Foam is just dripping, snarling, nasty. This creature has rabies. It is insane. Now, you as a parent would have absolutely every right to defend those children against that dog. Now, how are you going to defend the children against the dog? You would be justified in killing the dog. Why? Because you can't tame that dog. That's not possible. You can't cure it. You can't make a deal with it. You can't say, here, play with the stick and not eat the children. It doesn't work that way. When you have rabies, there is no sanity. You would be absolutely justified in destroying that animal. Now let's think about it for a second. I personally love dogs. I know I make jokes about it all the time. And I do remind you that cats are not Christians. Now, that's a fact. It's just true. And I make fun of my dogs because it's easy to make fun of them. They're as dumb as rocks. And they don't even know they're that dumb. I mean, I come walking in the house, and they're just like, oh my gosh, it's so great. Oh, you've been gone forever. I've been gone for 2 minutes. Dog does not know this. The dog is all over me. I love it. They're happy. They make you feel good, but they'll eat their own barf. There's something missing there. But the truth is, God did a good thing when he invented dogs. They're great. I love them. They're fun. They're happy. They're cuddly. They're great companions. You know, they love you even if you've been working in a sewer for 2 weeks. They just think, oh, you smell so interesting. I mean, they don't care. They're awesome. But just because I love dogs does not mean I should ignore a rabid one. Does it? No. You see. Now, what's important about that is that God decided, because God is the author, because God knows the human heart, because God knows what you do not know, that this culture was rabid. And the only way to deal with it before it spread to other cultures, before it spread to his people, before it destroyed the children on the playground, he had to destroy it. But even in that, listen, God was merciful even there. Let me tell you why. Because God could have dealt with the Canaanites the way he dealt with Sodom and Gomorrah. Let's take a look at the ruins of Sodom. This is all that's left of the city of Sodom. There it is. We're going to be going there in April just to check it out. But in this city, in these ruins here, here's what we've discovered. In the last 16 years of digging at the archaeological site here, we have proven beyond any reasonable doubt that this is the city of Sodom. Now, that city was devastated instantly because we now know that there was an airburst of either a comet or a meteor that came in this area. It came from southwest to northeast is where the explosion happened. We know this because we've found the evidence. The devastation here was so immediate and so intense that the heat was so hot that the pottery from the destruction layer is literally glazed on one side. Now, this is important because glazing was not invented until the Middle Ages. So finding glazing in the destruction layer tells us how hot it was. You don't find bodies at Sodom. You find bits and pieces of bones. These people were literally blown apart. God destroyed it instantly. And the destruction was so intense, the destruction layer here is 3 feet deep. I have a little vial of it in my office. I call it my vial of the wrath of God. But anyway, that destruction layer, 3 feet deep, still smells like smoke. That's how God dealt with Sodom. That's intense. In fact, the destruction was so intense that there is no record of any occupation in this area for 700 years. 700 years before it recovered from the blast. So you find the Middle Bronze Age, and then right on top of it, you find the Iron Age. That's a 700-year gap. That's what God could have done, but he didn't. Instead, he warned them for at least 40 years, because if you think about it, the Hebrew people were wandering on the other side of the Jordan in that area. They were trading with all the caravans that came in and out. And every time they did a trade deal, they said, hey, you guys are heading off into Canaan, aren't you? Yeah, that's going to be our next stop. We're going to Jericho. Okay, great. Remind them, we're on our way. Now, this is the worst military strategy in the world, is to warn your enemies that you are coming. But for 40 years, then when God said, it's time, he parked them on the other side of the Jordan River within sight of Jericho for a year. They sat there for a year going, we'll be there shortly, guys. We're coming. Tens of thousands of Canaanites went, that's a bad plan. We heard about what your God did in Egypt. We're out of here. Lots of them migrated out of Canaan. But those that stayed, they stayed, listen, because they felt that their culture and their God was superior to the God of the Hebrews. How many of you know there is no other God? And so they said, we're going to sit behind our 30-foot thick walls at Jericho. And the walls came tumbling down. When Jericho was destroyed, everybody in the whole land of Canaan heard about it. If Jericho can go down, who can stand against the God of Israel? So even there, God was being merciful, because he could have destroyed them like he did Sodom, but instead he warned them and warned them and warned them and warned them. And even with the destruction of one city, he warned them. And many of them did flee. But those that stayed were doing so in flat defiance of who God is. God is merciful, but God is just. I fear for the United States of America. We kill 3,000 children on the altar of self every single day. 3,000. Every day. That's the average. Verse 14. It says, you shall not worship any other God. For the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. I mean, if your name is jealous, you're jealous. And people get upset about this because they only see jealousy in negative terms. In our view, jealousy is always bad, but that is not true. In fact, the word jealous here in Hebrew is kenah. And kenah means to be zealous about, to be excited to anger over. So that can be both positive or negative, can it? I mean, you can be excited to anger over a good thing or a bad thing. Now, a bad thing from our point of view is when I get angry, I get angry at so-and-so because they have something that I wish I had. That is a bad form of jealousy. But there's a good form of it. Give you an example. Imagine, if you will, the horrible story of your daughter, about 14 or 15 years old, being lured away by a much older boyfriend who lures her in with drugs, and before you know it, she's selling her body on Van Buren down here. That's your little baby. Do you have a right to be excited to anger against the trafficker who did that to your kid? If you don't, there's something wrong with you. That's a good form of jealousy. Do you see it? Because you're excited to anger over, hey, that's my kid. You have no right to my baby. You have no right to do that to her. You have no right to lie to her and lock her in with drugs and do all this trafficking stuff. No right. That's my kid. You have a right to that anger. And there's a justice for that is right. How many of you agree with me on that? Because there are plenty of cultures in the world that say that that's perfectly acceptable. Did you know that? Just go to Thailand. The Philippines. I've been to a country where the legal age of consent is 12. I've seen prostitutes that are 14 years old, legal. And here's what I've discovered. God is going to be angry, fiercely angry, over the things that hurt his babies. Fiercely angry. Because his name is jealous. He wants what's best for you, and he will settle for nothing less. And this is the hard part. Because whenever you give your heart to something or someone that's going to damage you or hurt you, God will react. Because he never changes and he's eternal. And he loves you with a fierce and everlasting love. And if you're doing something that's going to destroy you or hurt you, he's going to be excited to anger. He's going to be kana over that. Does that make sense? Somebody say yes. Now, the truth is, he will also be excited to anger if you belittle his love for you. Or if you somehow suggest that God is not actually pursuing what's best for you because you're hurting and he's not solving your problem. Not the way you think he should, and certainly not on your timetable. Because it doesn't make sense to you. You belittle God's nature to want what's best for you. Now, some of you are looking at me going, that just doesn't make any sense. I mean, you hear about, we saw the trailer for Jeremy Camp and his story. His beautiful wife died, no matter how much they prayed. Spoiler alert. Sometimes we can't see the end. But how many of you know that God is bigger than time itself? And God sees things from an eternal point of view. Now look, it's like this. Imagine a dog, because we've been talking dogs. Imagine a dog you like, get its paw trapped in a bear trap. Snap. Can you imagine that? Terrible. Pain. Now that puppy, I'm here to tell you, if you approach that dog to try to free it from the trap, it will bite you. Why? Because the dog does not understand why it's in pain. It doesn't see the trap. It doesn't understand. In fact, if you actually freed it, it might step right back into the trap because it just doesn't see the trap. But what's worse is you as a human being, you are rational. You can see the trap. You know it even if the dog doesn't. But when you come up to try to help the dog, the only way to get its foot out of the trap is to push it deeper in. You have to push down. It's going to, can you imagine the pain? In order to release the trap. You know this. The dog does not. All the dog sees is that you're allowing pain. You're causing even more. How many of you know that God is way smarter than you? He left you in the dust a long time ago. You're just a puppy. I don't care how many degrees you got hanging on your wall, and I found this out from personal experience. We don't know nothing. We don't. Compared to him, he sees things. The beginning, the end, the eternal. He knows it all. And he knows that there are times where he's had to press me deeper into the pain in order to get me out of it. And I didn't like it either. And I have suffered in my life. Seriously suffered. To the point where I thought I couldn't breathe. Where I literally didn't care if I woke up the next morning. I've been that low. And my master did not solve my problem overnight. But looking back on it, him pushing me deeper in to set me free from a deeper trap that would have caught me later even worse. I see it now from a different perspective. I didn't see it then. Are you following me? This is important to understand that concept. God is jealous of what is best for you, so much so that he will do what it takes, even if it means pushing you deeper in order to get you out. But that's where trust comes from. Because if that puppy really trusts you, even if it hurts worse, the dog will let you do what it takes to get its paw out of the trap. A good dog will. How many of you know the dog doesn't trust you, it's just going to bite you? And that's what we do with God all the time, don't we? We bite him. We complain against him. We grumble. We get mad and we shake our fist at him because he's not solving it. That's just a dog biting. Don't go there. God is smarter than you. Smarter than me. Verse 15. He says, he's warning them, don't make a covenant with these people. Don't make an agreement with them. Otherwise, you might make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they would play the harlot with their gods and sacrifice to their gods, and someone might invite you to eat of his sacrifice, and you might take some of his daughters for your sons, and his daughters might play the harlot with their gods and cause your sons also to play the harlot with their gods. Now, what's he saying here? When he uses the word play the harlot, in Hebrew, this is rather graphic. It means to prostitute yourself. It means to go out and have sex with somebody for money. That's what it means. And what he's saying here is that from God's point of view, when people worship other gods, there are no other gods. There is only the one and only true God. All other gods are false, or they are things, demons, materials, attitudes, philosophies. They are things that people worship, but falsely because they're not gods. There's only one God. And when we go and worship some other God, when we devote ourselves to some other God, what we're doing is we're refusing to be devoted to the one and only true God, who deserves all of our loyalty, all of our devotion. Because he made us, and because he gave his only son in order to bring us back into relationship with him. He gave us everything. I mean, from God's point of view, when you go off and do these sorts of things, it would be like this. Imagine if, as a man, you married a woman from a foreign country. But in order to get her from that foreign country, you had to sacrifice literally everything that was most dear to you in order to get her to the United States. And when she finally gets here, and you marry her, you've given everything for her, and she says to you, I love you, I'm so grateful, I love America, I love this house, and boy, do I love the boys here in America. And while I love you on Tuesdays and on Thursdays, and especially on Friday nights, I'm out at the bars having sex with other men. But I love you. How many of you as men would not like that very much? That would excite you to some anger, some jealousy, and rightfully so. In the same way, there are plenty of people who say, I'm a Christian, I love God, but I go off and I do everything that you say I should not do in my life. I'm out fornicating and jumping from one bed to the next. I'm out doing all these. I'm out partying and drunkenness, even though you say do not. But I love you, Lord. You know, I come to church on Christmas and Easter. You're great. Yeah, that's harsh. It's also God's word. That's how God sees it when we're not fully devoted to him. See, look, if you belong to Jesus of Nazareth, if you're truly devoted to him, why are you checking your horoscope? Because that's the worship of the stars. Why are you listening to psychics and reading their books and watching their TV programs? They're listening to the whispers of demons in the dark. Why are you doing that? Why are you going up to Sedona and buying their crystals in their little shops here? Why are you doing that? That's the worship of the vortex and nature. You don't have to go very far to get this stuff, do you? The same newspaper that has daily prayer also has the daily horoscope. If you are a Christian and you are fully devoted to Jesus Christ, do not cheat on him. Don't. See, if you're truly devoted to Jesus. Now, people ask me this all the time. They do. They'll say to me, well, I really want to date so-and-so, but he's not a believer. If Jesus is the most important person in your life, why are you wanting to give your body and your life to someone who says, Jesus, whatever. Yeah, sure, fine, that's good for you. We should not be dating unbelievers. We should not be marrying unbelievers. If that's harsh, read the book again. Because I didn't make that up. That's not my idea. That's his. He said it to the Hebrews. He says it to Christians. God is jealous of you. He wants all of you. He wants your whole devotion in every aspect of your life. Your sexuality, your marriage, how you deal with your kids, everything. Your fears, don't go off to the mediums and the psychics. Don't play the harlot with him. This is who God is. He's calling you to a much higher level. Now, we're going to skip a little bit here, and I'll tell you why. Verses 17 through 26 is just a repeat in summary form of what we read in chapters 21 to 23. It's just kind of the short version. Is where he summarizes. Don't make any molten gods. Make sure you remember these feasts and all the stuff. We already went over that in chapter 21, so let's jump down to verse 27. Because I need to make a really important point here. And again, I'm going to summarize this a little bit in order to kind of, be good with the time here. So the Lord says to Moses, write down these words, for in accordance with these words I have made a covenant, an agreement with you and with Israel. So he was with the Lord for 40 days, 40 nights, did not eat or drink water. I mean, you're pretty intimate if you're not eating or drinking for 40 days. I mean, it's just you and God. He's sustaining you. Now, he wrote on the tablets, word of the covenant, 10 commandments, and then he came down from the mountain with the tablets, right? Now, look at the end of verse 29. It says, Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone. It was glowing because of his speaking with God. Did you see that? He was so close to God, he was speaking to God, that he was literally glowing. And when they saw him, verse 30, they were afraid to come near him. So verse 31, he tries to reassure them, says, come here, come closer. Verse 32, after they came near, he commanded them. Verse 33, when he finished speaking, he did what? He had to put a veil over his face because it was freaking people out. Does that make sense? All right, so, and whenever he went into the Lord, he took the veil off because he doesn't need the veil when he's talking to God. But when he came out, he would talk to them and then he'd put the veil back on. That's what it says here. Does that make sense? So the bottom line of this whole section is that when Moses came down, listen, his face was shining like a light bulb. Now, to you and I, that might have been kind of cool, but we would not have freaked out probably. But then again, these people had never seen a light bulb. They'd never seen a science fiction movie either. They don't know what a computer is, so the CGI makes no sense from their perspective. So to see somebody coming down the hill and going, okay, how many of you know, you'd be like, ah! Okay, you would be. And if you're not raising your hand, you're not paying attention. How many of you know you'd be freaked out? Okay, so they were freaked out. Okay, you get it. Now, the thing is, and this is my question, why are they freaked out? Wait a second. These people had seen the glory of God, hadn't they? Seen the fire pillar at night. They'd seen the Red Sea get split down the middle. These people saw flying frogs and blood back in Egypt. Remember that? I love the frogs. That's why I keep talking about them, because, I mean, it's so cool that God throws toads. But the thing is, they'd seen all of these exciting things. You would think one more exciting thing would be like, cool, one more exciting thing. But no, they reacted with fear. Fear so much that Moses had to put a veil on to protect them from their own fears. Now, wait a second. There's a disconnect here. And I'm going to be honest with you, I did not find this in any of the commentaries. This is just something that hit me. I said to myself, now, wait a second. If Moses' relationship with God is so intimate and so close that God is literally rubbing off on him. Why didn't somebody say, dude, I want that? Why are you glowing and I'm not? What are you doing to get so close to God that he's rubbing off on you? I want to get that close. Nobody said that. They just afraid. Man, that really struck me. It really bothered me. That really grabbed me. And then I thought to myself, it just proves a point about human nature. And that's something I got to warn myself against. Listen, the truth is, no amount of evidence is ever going to convince a stubborn, willful, self-absorbed heart to grow. No amount of evidence will do that. The evidence is right in front of their face. Moses is glowing like a light bulb. They don't even know what a light bulb is, and they should have went, wow, I don't even know what a light bulb is, and that's cool. But you know what? They're not. And too many Christians, listen to me, too many Christians choose their own self-interest. They choose those feelings that uplift their own comfort rather than doing what it takes to grow closer to him. And because of that, listen, because of that, it's going to stir up a conviction in you. And when you see somebody who's mature and growing, and they're literally glowing, it convicts you, makes you afraid, even angry. I've seen it. Remember, what's going to happen to these guys? They'd seen all of this stuff. They'd had a renewed covenant with God. And yet, these same people, we know, because we've read the rest of the story, what are they going to do? They're going to turn on Moses again. They're going to criticize him, grumble, complain, everything. It doesn't matter how many glowing faces they've seen or split seas down the middle or flying frogs. When they get to that point, instead of saying, what do I got to change in order to get closer to God the way Moses is? No. They're going to give into the bully mentality. What do bullies do? Bullies tear down others because they don't want to face their own immaturity, their own weakness, right? They don't want to face that. And so when they see something that's strong in you, they're going to criticize it, tear it down, make fun of you, mock, do something because they want to tear you down so they can feel better about their own weakness. Spiritual bullies do exactly the same thing. And unfortunately, because of human nature, there's a lot of spiritual bullies. Because, listen, I'm here to tell you that in your personal life, God is going to let you rub shoulders with some amazing, growing, powerful believers in Jesus. You know what I'm talking about? Like Moses, they're glowing and they don't even know it. Do they? They're just wandering around being who God made them to be. Being sweet and kind and being involved and growing and knowing the Word. And it convicts you, grabs at your heart. So what are you going to do? When you feel that conviction, are you just going to find fault in the person that you're looking at and listening to? You can find fault in all of us because none of us are Jesus. That's easy. All you got to do, any Christian you rub up against who's a mature, growing believer, you can find their flaws because they're still human. Are you going to focus in on their flaws, or are you going to go, why are you glowing and I'm not? What are you doing that I'm not? I'd rather sit and talk with you and how did you grow like that? How did you figure out how to love your wife? Instead of me being jealous of the great relationship you have and wishing I was with your wife, how about we sit down and you teach me, the younger man, how to be a good husband, huh? How about the wife who's constantly criticizing and tearing down her own husband? She gets jealous and angry at this other woman because she's got a good husband. Why don't you figure out, hey, girlfriend, come here, help me figure out how to be a good wife. Obviously you are. Instead of tearing each other down and becoming spiritual bullies the way the Hebrews did, why don't we do what they did not? They should have said, Moses, you're glowing. How do we do it? But instead they gave in to fear, which became complaining, grumbling, finding fault, rebellion, anger. And they wandered in the desert for 40 years instead of getting the promised land. You want the good marriage? Why don't you talk to the men and women who have good marriages instead of criticizing them? Instead of saying, well, if I only had your husband or your wife, well, then if I only had your kids, if I only had your job, no. You're doing it all wrong. And how many of you know that there's not a person in this room, and I include myself, that hasn't given in to that temptation at some point in life? We've all looked at others and went, well, if it was just like that for me, things would be. Come on. That's a trap. There are people that say it all the time. I would be more devoted to Jesus if I just had their situation, or if I had this miracle or that answer to prayer. That's just like the Jewish people. They saw all the miracles and they still refused to grow. Remember, Moses didn't even know he was glowing. He didn't even know it. And many of the mature people that you're going to run into, they don't know it either. Why don't we get in the habit of praying how we can glow too? And that's what I want to close with. Let's look at the key here. This is the bottom line of everything I'm trying to say here. Everything I learned when I was reading it is that when we spend vulnerable time with God, the way Moses did, the way we talked about for the last 2 Sundays in a row, where you're talking about how to go deep in his word, understanding how it fits into the rest of the word, its context, what it means, how to apply it, how to make it happen, how to force myself to get past my own obstinance and stubborn part of me that doesn't want to change. When I get vulnerable, when I get deep, when I spend the time, when I make the effort, when I climb the mountain, it's going to change you in ways you won't even realize. It's going to change you. You'll be glowing and not even know it. That's the good part. But if you're just waiting for some sort of miracle, right? You're just waiting for something to change, and then you'll be more devoted to Jesus. Well, if I could just have this, if you're waiting for some sort of miracle to change the things that you need to change, ain't going to change nothing. Are you with me? The vast majority of Christians don't grow. Don't be the vast majority. Let's pray. Well, Lord, we only went over 20 minutes this time. But you know why we did, Lord? Because you're so awesome, all we want to do is sit and talk about you all the time. Because, Lord, I think these people are with me. I think we would rather be glowing than criticizing or judging or fearful or refusing to face the things we got to change. You are just. You are holy. And you want more out of us. You are jealous. You want more out of us. You want a whole devotion out of us. And if we give it, we'll start changing in ways we can't even see. But man, that takes some change. So Lord, I pray for your people. I pray for myself. Open up our eyes to what we got to do to get so close to you that we glow like a light bulb. Instead of criticizing our situation, criticizing you for not fixing things, criticizing, grumbling, complaining, being the children of Israel. Help us to be more like Moses. And there's people in this room that are going to need to repent because all they've been doing is complaining about you, but they heard about the dog stuck in the trap. And now they're going, well, maybe that's why it hurts. And listen, friend, if that's you, during this prayer time between services, you need to come up here and get prayed for. Because just understanding that God might let it hurt even worse to get you out of the trap doesn't make it hurt any less. You need the love of your brothers and sisters to pray on you and help you and to hold you accountable and to stand with you through this trial. So don't be afraid to come up here during the prayer time and and find that. So I pray for your people, Father. Pray for your people. And I pray it in Yeshua Jesus' name. Amen.